This year's A-level results showed things changing and things staying the same. What changed was that grades are dramatically higher in 2021 than they were in 2019. That's the last time exams were used to determine grades. What stayed the same was that people who were lucky enough to be sent to private school dramatically outperformed those who go to state schools. I'll be speaking to an expert on Britain's educational class divide, as well as the impacts that COVID has had on it. I'm also joined tonight by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm very good, Michael. I'm very good. I'm very glad to be joining you.
And I'm glad to have you joining me. You'll probably notice my co-hosts, we've shifted around the days of the week this week. So we will have Dahlia. No, we will have Ash this week on Friday. Even I'm confused. We will also tonight be discussing an update on the Assange case, Stanley Johnson on Newsnight, and Prince Andrew getting sued for alleged sexual abuse. If you have any comments, do please tweet them on the hashtag TiskiSour or put them in the comments section. And make sure you hit subscribe if you are not already subscribed to the Novara Media YouTube channel. The coronavirus pandemic meant that examinations this year were impossible, and instead, grades were given out via teacher assessments. Those results were out yesterday. This is for A-levels, and unsurprisingly, grading was much more generous than usual. As you can see from this chart from the Sutton Trust, the proportion of A stars has gone up from 8% in 2019 to 19% this year. 2019, of course, being the last time exams were used. For A grades, they've gone up from 18% to 25% of all grades awarded. By the time you get to C grades, that pattern is reversed. What stayed the same is just as significant, and that's the huge divide in results granted to state school pupils and those in independent schools. I prefer just calling them private schools. I'm not sure why we call them independent schools. Anyway, the already large gap there has only increased. Again, this is from the Sutton Trust. The percentage of pupils getting A or above by school type in 2019, it was 44%. In 2021, it's 70%. In looking at academies, in 2019, it was 24%. In 2021, it was 42%. For sixth forms, it's 22% and 35%. And for comprehensives, it's 20% to 39% getting A or above. So an increase in all of those schools, but as you can see, a bigger increase among private school students than anyone else. Sir Kevin Collins was appointed by Boris Johnson to advise the government on how our education system could recover from the COVID pandemic. Of course, very relevant because we're seeing that gap only increase. He resigned when his advice was ignored by Boris Johnson, and he spoke to Radio 4 this morning.
There's a huge risk that one of the legacies of COVID, the education legacy of COVID, could be growing inequality. Now, to tackle that and to deal with that, we need a comprehensive, robust and long-term plan. I don't believe that recovery will happen naturally, and I think if we don't do something intentional about it, we will have growing inequality in our education system.
Now, you came up with a comprehensive plan, £15 billion worth of it. It was rejected. Do you know who rejected it? Do you know why it was rejected?
No, it was never my job to decide. It was my job to advise, and it's perfectly valid for people to decide they don't want to take that advice. I think that's completely okay. I think my issue is that whether you accept my plan or any plan, we must have a plan. This has to be intentional work. It won't happen by accident or just naturally, in my view.
We must have a plan with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister and Gavin Williamson as Education Secretary. I personally do not have much confidence one will be forthcoming. To discuss the educational divide and the long shadow of COVID, I'm now joined by Jeevun Sandher, an economist at King's College London, researching inequality and poverty, and a former official at the Treasury. Jeevun, we already had an incredibly unequal education system before the pandemic hit. Can you talk about how COVID has changed that? Has it made it worse, and in what ways?
Yeah, has certainly made it worse. I mean, look, let's think about where we were before this pandemic, right? A disadvantaged student was about 18 months behind by the time they started their GCSEs. And those divides in education, they don't just start at birth, they start before birth, okay? Because not having enough money is stressful. Women on low income are twice as likely to miscarry. Their children are much more likely to have low birth weight. That means by the time they start school, they're already 4 months behind their children are. They've heard 4 million fewer words. So children from disadvantaged backgrounds are already doing worse. And then COVID hit. And as with the labour market impact, the same thing happened in schools as well. Those on high incomes, relatively well shielded. Those on low incomes really suffered. 1 in 5 on free school meals didn't have access to a computer at the start of this pandemic. 1 in 3 on the pupil premium didn't have a quiet place to study. We saw hunger rise as well. And hungry kids, they really don't learn very well. So we would have expected in any case for this to hit low income kids harder. And then we had this system of A-level grades, teacher assessed grades that hit those kids even worse. Now, I want to be clear, like I'm an academic and I'm part of a program that teaches disadvantaged children in schools. I did it before this pandemic. I did it beforehand. And teachers and kids did a heroic job. I can't commend them enough. But then they had this system of A-level grades where each school had to try and cobble together some system to try and grade their children. And the truth is, for national qualifications, you need national standards. Instead, teachers had to do their best. And what happened? Well, Ofqual's own research said that disadvantaged kids were most likely to lose out, most likely to suffer from unconscious biases, most likely not to be in school because COVID hit them harder. And we saw that in the grade results as well. You showed there earlier that I think 70% of A stars and A's private schools. But we also have to think about is the fact they got a much higher increase, 12% increase in A stars at private school compared to 4% at comprehensives. Now, I don't think kids at private school did that much better than this year. I think they got luckier because of the system they were kind of left with. There's also another divide between those in the middle and at the bottom as well. Those on free school meals fall further behind those who weren't on free school meals. So we've seen this divide open up at each point, the top putting further away from the middle and the bottom falling further away from anyone else. And the final thing to say about this is that this year might have been difficult, but next year, because universities are so oversubscribed, will be the hardest year for kids to get into Russell Group universities. And who is going to suffer? Undoubtedly those disadvantaged and low income children.
Is that when this is going to hit then? Because I know you're talking about, and you're rightly talking about how the gap between private school kids and state school kids and kids on different incomes has increased this year. But because everyone's grades have increased, I suppose that's kind of masked. If people are generally getting higher grades than they would have otherwise got, they're not that inclined to complain that other people are getting even higher grades because they're pleasantly surprised by what they've been given. Is that now going to leak out of the system, and we're going to end up with way more disappointed working class kids than we have over the last decade? Or I mean, what happens next?
So without a doubt, next year is going to be the really big one. I mean, this year as well, let's be clear, universities gave out less offers because of the exam fiasco last year as well. We'll have to see exactly what happens inside the numbers, but I am expecting that actually disadvantaged kids still would have lost out this year, but next year it's going to be absolutely awful. I mean, I'm hearing about courses that are oversubscribed by over 100%. There's just no way to kind of make up that shortfall. There aren't enough resources. There aren't enough teaching staff either. In future years, we're going to see this really, really hit very badly. I mean, this year has been bad, but it will be worse in future years. The other thing that will, of course, happen in future years is about those students who didn't sit their A-levels, but are further down kind of in the educational system, and their learning is going to suffer. And as has been covered beforehand, there is just not a system in place to ensure they can make up that lost learning.
Is there any kind of plan? I mean, you've almost preempted that question, but I mean, we heard there Kevin Collins say there needs to be a plan. It's not my role to decide what the plan is, but there needs to be a plan. I haven't seen one yet. Have you seen any inkling of investment or plans to help kids recover after spending almost a year out of school? And if not, what should it look like?
So the plan that the government released is worth 1.5 billion. And as Kevin Collins covered, the one they wanted was 15 billion. Now that 15 billion plan would have had things like longer school days, summer schooling, one-to-one tutoring, and a whole range of educational investments as well, including emotional support as well. For anyone who wants to see the details, I would recommend the Educational Policy Institute report. It's incredibly comprehensive. Instead, we got 1.5 billion pounds for a year lost schooling. Now to put that number into context, Eat Out to Help Out, 1 month of us having freer or rather cheaper meals almost cost $1 billion. So we're spending much, much less than we did, or rather proportionally less than we did on ensuring we had free school meals, and also completely unequal to the task at hand. I mean, the benefits of spending that 15 billion, at least 60 billion pounds. So if you're looking at this in pounds and pence, it's definitely a good investment. In likelihood, like to be much, much higher. And as an economist, like investing in children's schooling it's harder to think of investment that has a high return. And it's absolutely baffling the decision was made. And I would struggle to think of what the rationale was behind that.
Let's talk about the broader divides in education, which I suppose pre-existed COVID. And before you listed, I suppose, some of the arguments as to why that inequality exists, overworked parents, low-income kids, even before they enter school, are underperforming their richer peers. To what extent is this about inequalities outside the school and inequalities inside the school? We often focus on private schools and state schools, but is that actually, are we then not seeing the wood for the trees? Is it the fact that actually it's the inequalities outside of school that matter more?
Yes, we know that parents and schools make a huge difference in kind of primary school, and as well as kind of your peers make a big difference in times of where you are in secondary school. And on both levels, kind of this government has failed, and it's particularly around early years education. Okay, we know early years education has a huge impact on your later learning, and we know we have a system here that just isn't up to task. Okay, so I think around childcare providers are about underpaid by about a third. There just isn't enough funding in the system. So by the time you get to school, you're already falling further behind. Spending per pupil is now 10% lower than it was in 2010 as well. And as you rightly pointed out, outside of school, 4,500 fewer youth workers, hundreds of fewer youth centres as well. This is a whole system, right? Like, it is not just about education, but a huge part of it is, are teachers well resourced enough? You need that as well to begin with, but you need both sides of it. You need to have a good kind of home environment, a good community, and a good learning environment to raise a child. Okay, it doesn't just take a village, it also takes a school and your parents as well. So you need all three of those things to really kind of match up together to give kids the best start in life.
And the big way into this section was the difference in attainment between kids at private schools and the kids at state schools. You've talked a lot about investment. Is it the case that however much we invest in state schools, private schools will just invest that little bit more, and so they'll always have grades which are much better than at state schools, and you'll always just have this baked in inequality in the education system? Do you think there is any way of closing that gap without just abolishing private schools?
I think actually, like, private schools spend about £15,000 a student, and the estate system is about £6,000. So my view is, actually, our state schools should be so good that no one wants to send their kid to Eton, right? That we should get it that much. And also, by the way, tax private schools on VAT at the moment. Of course, they still have VAT relief. And so I think that actually we should see if we can get there, right? If private schools keep pushing it further and further up, fine. But at the very least, you need to start closing that gap, and you need to make our state schools to be best. I mean, our schools should be absolute paragons of learning. If tomorrow is supposed to be the knowledge economy, where what we do, or rather what we know, matters the most, then we should be preparing our kids for that. That's such a high investment return. I don't think that, like, abolishing private schools is also going to get rid of that issue. Like, if you were to abolish private schools, I mean, middle-class parents are still going to invest in private tutoring. They're still going to do everything they can do to ensure their kids can get ahead. Now, every parent wants their kid to get ahead, but therefore every child should have the opportunity to get ahead. And that's where I see being the real issue. Like, let's at least increase investment to get to our state schools are absolutely brilliant.
No, I mean, I think we all agree that investing in state schools is the priority. I think they probably will send them to Eton because they're then likely to be sitting next to a future prime minister. Also, I haven't read enough about this, but China, they've just abolished private tuition. I think there are some other East Asian countries that have done it as well. This might be sending us down a bit of a detour. I don't know if you want to respond to that as a final question. Should we abolish private tuition like they've done in China?
I mean, again, yeah, I would like to see every kid have the best tuition possible. Like, I just, I'm basically very reticent about banning anything in one respect. And like, if you want to spend money on your kid's education, that seems to be like a choice that people should be able to make. But at the end of the day, I think every kid should have the best education possible and not have to worry about that.
Jeevun Sandher, thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. I should probably clarify about China. I think they haven't actually abolished private tuition. What they have done is said that private tuition companies, which at the moment are making enormous profits throughout China, they have to become non-profit companies. So a few billion has been knocked off their value on the stock exchange. A number of explanations for this. One is that they want to make bringing up children cheaper, and so they want to end this idea where you all have to compete with other parents by spending loads of money on private tuition. Anyway, that is one for another show. A couple of comments. Dina Al Axa tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour. Really glad to hear the commentary about the barriers faced by low-income kids. I went to a seriously shitty comprehensive and I only managed to get good grades because the model minority myth was drilled into me as a kid. Super interesting comment. And Matthew Tarr with €10. Hi, Michael. Could you please wish my wife, Deborah, a happy birthday? We're both big supporters of Novara and the invaluable work you do. Tysky Sour is our go-to evening viewing. Thank you for that very kind comment and happy birthday to Deborah. We are going to stay on the subject of education. Obviously, we've been talking about some of the longer term issues with the education system in Britain. One of the short term issues has been that we have for the past 2 years had an education secretary who is completely, and I have to emphasize this, completely incompetent, absolutely appalling at his job. Everyone, it seems, from every political persuasion admits that Gavin Williamson is not up to the job. He couldn't get laptops to kids 9 months into the pandemic. Now, because it is universally accepted he's not particularly good at his job, there are suggestions that he is about to be replaced, and the Times are suggesting that will be by Kemi Badenoch. The Times has been told this by multiple sources, apparently, and they report that Douglas Smith, a Conservative fixer for 3 decades who has been brought into Johnson's number 10 team, is said to be pushing for Badenoch, who's 41, to have the role in the reshuffle. Smith, who is married to Munira Mirza, the Prime Minister's Downing Street policy director, is said to be a key influence at number 10, informing the government's stance on woke issues such as race, trans rights and attacks on historic statues. Badenoch is said to have impressed Smith and others in the party's hierarchy. Now, for me, this really, really shows where Tory priorities lie. Yes, they should sack Gavin Williamson. They should have sacked Gavin Williamson a year ago. But now it seems that the principal criteria for who to replace him with isn't who can best manage this, formidable task, which is organising catch-up learning for a lot of kids who've been out of school for a year. It is putting someone in that role who they think has been successful at fighting culture wars, someone who they back on woke issues, who they think has been good at standing up and saying, no, we shouldn't attack statues and we shouldn't teach critical race theory in schools. Now, whatever you think about critical race theory in schools, I mean, they don't teach critical race theory in schools. This is just a complete scare story anyway. But even if you believe that, the idea that this is a priority for our education system right here and right now, I think it tells you everything you need to know about Boris Johnson and his government. Apparently, it turns out Gavin Williamson is not planning to take any sacking lightly. They quote a Tory MP as saying he is wetting himself about getting the sack. He keeps telling people he knows where the bodies are and the PM is too weak to sack him. So we have a Prime Minister planning to put in place a new Education Secretary, principally because she's tough on woke issues, and an Education Secretary who is refusing to leave because he has secrets on the Prime Minister. This is not how our country should be governed. I want to go to one more issue involving Gavin Williamson. He caused controversy on an issue yesterday I want to discuss. Here he is answering a question on whether universities that don't go back to full face-to-face teaching should have to charge lower tuition fees.
Well, I think universities have got to sort of stand up their offer to their own students. I think that they have the flexibility and the ability to deliver face-to-face lectures. I'd expect them to be delivering face-to-face lectures. Well, they are autonomous institutions. I don't have control over them.
No, I understand that, Minister, but my question is, do you think they should be refunded?
We would expect university to delivering a high-quality teaching experience, and part of that is actually doing face-to-face lectures.
And if they don't, should there be a refund for those students?
Universities have got to stand up their offer to their students, but we've got the Office for Students, which is targeting universities which have low-quality courses, which aren't doing enough, and will give the OFS all the power, all the backing, in order to pursue those universities that aren't delivering enough for students that are paying their fees. And of course, the government are underpinning. I'm asking your
opinion, Minister. What do you think?
Well, I think if universities are not delivering what students expect, then actually they shouldn't be charging the full fees of what they're done.
So that statement there from Gavin Williamson has been pushed back against by the Russell Group of Universities and Universities UK. They said a hybrid model is still appropriate and that lecture theatres could pose a risk of COVID transmission. Apparently 20 out of 24 Russell Group universities have said next term they will be providing some undergraduate teaching online. For their part, the Office for Students who regulate universities have said hybrid learning is fine, so long as they can show, or so long as universities can show they're providing a good quality experience of higher education. Aaron, What do you make of Gavin Williamson's argument there that universities who stick with online lectures should have to cut their fees?
I agree with him, Michael.
Go on, explain.
I saw Labour. Well, look. First of all, his answer is sort of broadly, it's comprehensible. You know, obviously you're trying to get this sort of Paxman-esque, yes, no, do you agree or disagree? But there's something which, it's not a regulator, but it resembles one. And it can call out universities if they're not basically providing the kind of services that students would expect. So I think that's actually broadly what is happening. It's what happened last year. A lot of the remote learning was just not good enough. They were crap. They were basically crap YouTube videos. It's one thing to say we can't have, you know, offline face-to-face learning. Totally get that, but then not to invest in actually the technical and, you know, the sort of the engineering back end to provide people really good, effective resources, which generally speaking didn't happen, Michael. Universities pivoted towards this incredibly poorly, generally speaking. And so, given that, I do agree with him. I don't think that they're getting value for money. And people like Universities UK, who, by the way, I'm blocked on Twitter by them, Michael, they wanted tuition fees to go to £9,000 because they were saying this will allow us to invest in a better product for students, and you know they need to be treated like consumers because that will create a more efficient marketplace, etc., etc. Live by the sword, die by the sword, Michael. You know. I like my biblical analogies, and this is what's happened. They wanted their students to be like customers and consumers, and that's what you've got. And if that's the case, you have to understand and you have to accept fundamentally that consumers aren't going to pay the same price for an inferior product, which is what has happened. So either they have to refund them or they have to give them an online product as good or hopefully even better than what they were getting before, which I don't think anybody is claiming. Who's claiming that these hybrid learning structures which were provided last year were as good as what they were previously offering? Nobody's saying that. Nobody's serious. So I think, of course, they should be getting refunds. Of course they should. That's how the private market works. But of course, if you're Universities UK, if you're these university managers on £200,000, £300,000, £400,000 a year, you only want the private sort of sector. You only want market, market fundamentalism when it suits you. Oh God, no! If it means I can't get a pay rise next year, or if it means I can't go on soirees and have really expensive dinners with people, and we can't build this new stand in my honor, that can't be my legacy as a member of university management. By the way, most of these people are failed academics or incredibly mediocre ones. Then no, I don't want the market. Here's the thing, Michael. The invisible hand never picks up the bill. This is what they wanted. They should accept this is where they are. Their students are now consumers, and if your consumers are pissed off, you're going to have to do something about it. They can't have the best of both worlds.
Well, presumably, I mean, we can have a discussion about whether or not universities should be free, but presumably what they'd argue is, look, these people chose to pay these fees. They're still, people know that it's going to be a hybrid system next year and people are still going to university, right? So I mean, they can say that the free hand of the market means that people are willing to pay us $9,000 a year, even if some of them are complaining. I think that the bigger issue here
But that's not what happened. For this year, I agree with you. I think people aren't going into this academic year under any illusions. Last year, Michael, there was quote
people were missold a product, is what you mean?
100%. 100%. And there was a level of certainty communicated by university management. I'm not saying every university, but you saw multiple institutions where this happened. And they were selling a level of certainty, which was frankly, I think it was morally unacceptable. And certainly they couldn't really be sure of what they were really saying. Of course, they had to say it because they were terrified they wouldn't get sufficient numbers because, of course, they need the consumers because that's where their revenues come from. So I think they were missold a product, Michael. And I think the consequence of that are you are going to be criticized by your consumers, and I think they're right to ask for their money back.
No, I think that's a good point.
Or is it not the same,
No, I was looking at next year, but I think you're absolutely right. A lot of those university managers did give a completely misleading impression to their students. I suppose one thing I would dispute there with Gavin Williamson is I do think that, in-person seminars are 100% necessary. I mean, you want to be having those conversations with your teachers and your peers. In-person lectures, I mean, for me, lectures was just loads of people sitting in the same room looking in the same direction. They could have happened on YouTube. So I'm not actually sure that the experience of going to university is particularly undermined by lectures being online. For many people, it might be improved, to be honest, because it just means you don't have to get up in time. So seminars for me have to be in person. Lectures, less so. It seems a bit arbitrary.
It could be. Keyword, it could be, but they generally aren't because the investments weren't made and the technical know-how and the expertise wasn't there. Novara Media, we were when the pandemic hit, we were very effective and efficient at working with remote processes, and we had line management, we had sort of content creation flows and all this stuff, growth journeys, all this crap that people talk about. We could do it pretty effectively, not having to see one another in an office. So we were quite lucky to do that. Universities weren't like that, and they didn't really make a major effort to change. And from what I have seen, Michael, the products that students generally had to engage with, I agree with you. It could be as good. It could even be better, right? And it should have been before the pandemic, but it wasn't. And that's not just limited, by the way, to like a YouTube lecture. They could think really radically and innovatively on this stuff. Some universities did, but the vast majority didn't. And I think that's why they shouldn't expect their consumers, which is what they wanted them to be, to pay the exact same price for an inferior product when they missold it. I don't think in any other industry that would be acceptable.
Yes, interesting point. Let's go to a couple of comments. Oliver Kant with a $5. Too many schools are about prepping for Fordist-type warehouse and precariat jobs and not passing down vital knowledge and enlightening kids. Very interesting comment. I do think you basically just need to... I've worked in a school and they were quite disciplinarian. And my analysis of it was kind of that was the only way to make that school work with the amount of money they had. If you want to give people like this holistic education where you're not as disciplinarian and you can let people explore their own ideas and avenues of thought, that actually requires a really high teacher to student ratio. Otherwise, you're going to lose control quite quickly. So for me, the issue is give schools shed loads more money and then they will have the space to become more imaginative than they already are. I'm not that convinced that there's head teachers everywhere that are trying to just, mold students to be Amazon warehouse workers. I think the fact that you have an education system that sometimes looks like that has more to do with people struggling to use very limited resources to the best ability they can manage. People will disagree. Con Mac tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Gavin Williamson talks about levelling up by reintroducing Latin or singing, I forgot about that, or singing about Britain being great, papering over the growing divisions in our school. We need real change with radical policies in and out of schools to shorten the gap. I think what that comment is a great reminder of is how Gavin Williamson's priorities aren't just wrong. They're like, they're catastrophically wrong. The fact that this guy was the education secretary throughout a pandemic where he should really have been as busy as the health secretary, for all you can say about Matt Hancock, lots of problems. He was definitely present, right? He was talking about what he was doing. People were asking him questions. He put himself forward for, some scrutiny. Gavin Williamson was just sort of asleep on the job. He'd appear every now and again writing a comment piece about statues. It's like, seriously, managing the education system over this pandemic should have been, a military-style task. Absolutely nothing from the guy. Instead, this nonsense about teaching Latin. Of course, GCSE results are out tomorrow, so we will come back to education as an issue tomorrow. Apparently, Keir Starmer has called for Gavin Williamson to resign. I think he's done that a few times already. Apparently, this time he's doing it over exam results. Caroline Duvier, hashtag Tysky Sour. What a slap in the face, Aaron. We worked incredibly hard to offer great online courses to our students. So you're saying me as a lecturer, I'm not worth it, even when I'm immunocompromised and don't want to die going to campus. Aaron, I feel like you should respond to that one.
I'm not saying that, obviously. I'm obviously not saying that. It has nothing to do with the quality of the lecturers. It has everything to do with the quality of the infrastructure built by the universities. Does the university that you work at, does it have a head of remote? Does it have, the CTO, the chief technology officer, does it even have one? Probably not. How are they having a holistic understanding of how they were going to do this last year? Not this year, last year. From what I saw, virtually every single institution I saw and how they dealt with this, technologically, was very, 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 very poor. And we're talking about allegedly world-class institutions. British universities are some of the best in the world. A place like UCL or Imperial or King's, which aren't meant to be, the top 5, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, these are still meant to be attracting world-class talent. Undergraduate students, but also in graduate research and certain disciplines, they're meant to be, some of the best. And yet they couldn't get this right. And I think that's fundamentally because of the kind of people managing them. So it's absolutely nothing to do with the lecturers. And I don't think people should be, I said quite clearly, I think it's very possible to do online lectures and online seminars. I agree with you, Michael. I don't think, for instance, lectures are wise. I think an offline seminar is generally a good thing, but I think a lecture could be entirely remote. But the systems weren't being built by these people because fundamentally the priority wasn't getting the best value for students. It isn't in higher education. It hasn't been. It hasn't been for a very long time. It hasn't been. You know, the ability to produce stuff like this is going down every year. It's getting cheaper and cheaper to do, and yet kids are paying more and more for less and less. And they've been doing that for a very long time, probably 20 years. That's not a criticism of the academics. It's a criticism of university managements not utilising these technologies properly.
No, I think that I think that distinction is quite important, actually, because I mean it can be the case that students are saying the service we're provided this year after it's gone remote has declined, and academics, which many are saying, is it's even harder delivering these lectures remote because we have to do more preparation. It's harder to make it engaging, etc., etc. It can be the case that the academics are working harder, the students are getting think they're getting a worse service, and both are absolutely correct, because the problem is that it's the medium that is the problem as opposed to the effort that either party are putting.
Well, what we were saying, Michael, I'll be quick because I know you want to move on, but we were saying at the beginning of the academic year it probably was wise just not to do it, right? Or to suspend things by several months to get those systems in place, but also not to, again, missell to young people, oh, go to university in September, everything's fine. And that created a spike in many places, actually. So, we weren't saying, oh, they have to go back in September and they need to be face-to-face. We were saying delay this and build something worth paying for. And also not stressing out the, staff at the face of this. So my sympathies are with the person whose comment that was, but I'm certainly not blaming them.
Let's move on to our next topic. If you're enjoying tonight's coverage, make sure to let us know by hitting that like button. US authorities are still pursuing the extradition of Julian Assange to face charges of espionage. Back in January, a judge blocked Assange's extradition. That was on the basis that Assange was likely to kill himself if he was held under the harsh conditions of the US prison system. But the US are disputing that. They're appealing the decision, and they want to appeal the decision on the basis that the expert witness, the psychiatrist who said that Julian Assange was at risk of suicide, was unreliable. They're suggesting he was unreliable because he didn't disclose something about Julian Assange, which was that when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, he fathered 2 children. The lawyer says he kept that to himself because it was, an issue of privacy for Julian Assange. A judge today has ruled that that does potentially undermine the expert witness. The Guardian report. Delivering the latest decision, Lord Justice Holroyd said it was very unusual for an appeal court to have to consider evidence from an expert that had been accepted by a lower court, but also found to have been misleading, even if the expert's actions had been deemed an understandable human response designed to protect the privacy of Assange's partner and children. All of this means, and this is what I find quite depressing, that this October we're going to have another court case which is based on quite how suicidal is Julian Assange. Like I think the fact that this is the basis of the court case, I'm obviously not blaming the lawyers here. The lawyers have to use whatever means they possibly can to stop a whistleblower being tried for espionage. So, all credit to the lawyers. But the fact that our legal system means that instead of discussing freedom of speech and discussing the fact that we are extraditing someone who's done journalism for espionage, they're discussing whether or not, quite how suicidal he is. I find that incredibly depressing. Let's go to the lawyer for the US because she makes it quite clear, I suppose, how grim this all is. So Claire Dobbin is her name. She said, he has not made the sort of serious attempt on his life or have the history of serious self-harm seen in other cases. It really requires a mental illness of a type that the ability to resist suicide has been lost. Part of the appeal will be that Mr. Assange did not have a mental illness that came close to being of that nature and that degree. Dobbin also argued that Assange proved he was able to withstand dire conditions by remaining trapped in the Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years. Aaron, I want to bring you in on this. I mean, from my perspective, I don't feel like I'm in a position to adjudicate as to whether the judge has made a reasonable decision here. I don't have the experience in jurisprudence to know whether or not an expert witness withholding a piece of information because they wanted to maintain the privacy of their client is valid or not. I don't know. What I find grim, though, is that when we should have an issue which is based on freedom of speech, which is based on the right to protect whistleblowers. Instead, we are saying, oh, the guy should go to America unless there is zero chance that he won't kill himself. We have to be absolutely sure that he will kill himself, otherwise he gets extradited. It seems just completely bizarre to me. Aaron, what do you make of it?
I mean, it's just unbelievable, isn't it? This Claire Dobbin lady, the case that's being made for the United States. I mean, it's just bizarre. Also, how do you test this hypothesis? We don't think he'll kill himself, and then if he kills himself in a US prison, oh, sorry, we were wrong. You have an independent assessment by a professional who's familiar with these things, which is precisely what happened. So you're obviously right. The nuances of the case are above our pay grade, but clearly the politics of the whole thing stinks. And you're right as well, Michael. Maybe you want to talk about this. Maybe I'm jumping the gun a bit, but there is an issue in talking about suicide. And of course, we've had multiple high-profile suicides in the US prison system in recent years. Most recently, of course, Jeffrey Epstein. We'll be talking about him later on. So the idea that, well, the last time you had a very high-profile inmate, they allegedly killed themselves. Why would Mr. Assange be any different? Specifically, if they're, of a politically sensitive nature, I think is a good one. The suicide rate in American prisons and jails is very high. It's very, very high. And as is self-harm. I think about 20% of people in the US prison system are assessed as having profound mental health issues. So obviously he's been through a great deal of mental stress. You don't have to like the guy. You might think he's done wrong. You might think he should be incarcerated. But I don't think anybody would dispute the fact he's in clear emotional mental distress. That's visible just from his appearance. He's obviously been through a very unique thing. But I am worried as well, Michael. We're talking about his case in a completely wrong way. We aren't talking about the political substance of what's happened. And it's important to say, look, they think this is what gets him off. I mean, that's the case. I mean, but my point is, from a political standpoint, it's a shame that we're not talking about the substance of what this man's done. And obviously, this is meant to be about justice. Right now, the Taliban is recapturing Afghanistan. Britain, the United States, and their allies went there 20 years ago, actually a month after 9/11, effectively. And we've been there for 20 years. Britain only spent about 35 billion, which is obviously an immense amount of money. It's about £2,000 per family, per household. But together, $2 trillion was spent in Afghanistan. 100,000 Afghan civilians died. I think more than 2,000 US combat personnel died. More than 450 British combat personnel died. Many more got PTSD, lost limbs, etc., etc. Profound, devastating loss. And people like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks were trying to expose the military war machine, the commercial military war machine behind that intervention, behind war in Iraq, and show actually they didn't go there with good intentions, generally speaking, and they certainly weren't playing by the book. And WikiLeaks exposed, for instance, disgusting attacks on civilians, I think things that border on war crimes, etc., forms of illegal detention. I don't know specifically about Afghanistan, but most certainly in Iraq. And that war machine can't allow Julian Assange to get away with it. And so we are now living in a world where the goodies, the people who uphold justice, are the ones that went to Afghanistan, spent $2 trillion. Actually, nothing changed, except now the Taliban have Humvees and Apache helicopters. They didn't 20 years ago. All right. And people might say, well, they won't have them very long. They'll get shut down or they'll be drone strikes, probably. But are they going to take Kabul and Kandahar first? Yes, I imagine. So who are the good guys? Julian Assange, who exposed that, or these other people who profit from war? They profited from selling all this military hardware, and they're going to profit from the machines now destroying the military hardware being used by the Taliban. And I think there's a certain sort of poetic element to it. I don't like to use that word, but I think that's what it is. These events right now in Afghanistan are ongoing. The government of Afghanistan is collapsing in the face of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the Taliban, while Julian Assange is potentially being extradited back to the United States. And this is the argument we're having. Oh, well, we don't think he's going to kill himself. What a toxic civilization we are living in, Michael. Utterly barbaric and toxic. And I don't think you need to be on the left to say, you know what, in 50, 60, 70 years' time, people will look at that as a what the fuck moment. What the fuck? They'll be looking, and I'm sorry to use the F-bomb in front of our audience, but that's exactly what it is. And they'll be looking at the first 20 years of the 21st century, culminating in our defeat in Central Asia and the Middle East, culminating in what's happening to Julian Assange. God willing, he doesn't go to the United States and he's let free. And they will say, wow, they spent trillions of dollars destroying Central Asia for no particular reason, literally for the status quo ante. Actually, no, that's not true. We did do one thing, which is massively increase opium production in Afghanistan. That's the legacy. Instead of putting that money into climate change and transitioning our economy away from fossil fuels. And the people that did it were the good guys. The people that did it were the good guys, and the bad mean guy was Julian Assange, enemy of national security. You know, we don't need to wait 50, 60 years to say that's a crock of shit, Michael, because it is. But that will be the universal consensus, God willing, in our lifetimes. Because it's going to be very satisfying seeing the people doing this right now being lamented and looked upon and despised and pitied and hated.
I wholly agree with all of that. We're going to return, of course, to this case in October. So that's when the actual appeal will be heard. Just to emphasize, what was decided today is that in that appeal hearing in October, they can bring into dispute the evidence from the psychiatrist, because the judge has decided that even though it's accepted by the previous judge, maybe there were things that judge hadn't taken into account. Let's go on to our next story. Before that, if you are a supporter of Novara Media, thank you so much. You make this all possible. If not, please do go to novaramedia.com/support. The release of the latest IPCC report on Monday was one of the few occasions where climate change got the attention in our mainstream media that it deserves. It did get basically wall-to-wall coverage. It should get wall-to-wall coverage most days. It got it this Monday. That was because that historic report was released. It's also fair to say, though, that some of the decisions made by our broadcasters when it comes to who to platform to discuss that issue were a little odd. The oddest was probably the environmentalist platformed by BBC Newsnight. Let's take a look at this particular clip.
Where we are at the moment, facing what we face, I see one really important thing the government to do, and that is to go strongly down the road of carbon taxing. This is the polluter pays principle. We all signed up to it. When I was in the EU way back in 1970s, we actually had a legal instrument, which the UK applied as well. We have to go there. And part of that, of course, is also to have carbon border taxes. Yes, we will impose our own standards and our own taxes and our own charges, and that'll generate so much money that we can help the white van man, we can help the disadvantaged sectors of society through the extra funds raised. It's a crucially important instrument which is not being adequately emphasized at the moment.
So that environmentalist invited onto Newsnight's climate change special had a fairly familiar face, a fairly familiar voice, and a familiar surname. And that's because, as well as being an environmentalist, he's Boris Johnson's father. Aaron, Newsnight got rinsed for giving Stanley Johnson the tagline environmentalist. I think he has expressed concern about the environment in the past, but he's clearly not one of the leading environmentalists in the country. He was invited on because he happens to be the Prime Minister's father. Why didn't they just put that on the tagline? Prime Minister's father, who we've invited on because the Prime Minister is too terrified to talk to us. I mean, the whole thing was just completely bizarre, wasn't it?
Well, as a repeat performance of what we saw in the 2019 election, Michael, you might remember Channel 4 had a climate debate. Boris Johnson refused to turn up. I believe in the end it was Rishi Sunak versus Rebecca Long-Bailey. She destroyed him, by the way. She was the most eloquent Labour performer on climate change, and she's not even in the shadow cabinet, which is unbelievable. And guess who turns up instead? It's Stanley Johnson. He demanded he be allowed to talk on the stage, and he wasn't. I mean, wow, it's pretty dysfunctional, Michael, where you have it's not just the Prime Minister isn't willing to actually be scrutinised for the policies he's outlining on one of the biggest, I think the biggest, but I think, even if you don't think it's the biggest, it's one of the biggest political issues of the day. And his dad turns up instead. And now this is and by the way, good for Channel 4. They said, please, go away. Now the BBC are indulging it. And there's a great quote, which is, ecology or environmentalism without class struggle is gardening. And that to me just sums up somebody like Stanley Johnson. It's true that he's had he's been involved in, I think the best word is conservation for decades, the World Wildlife Fund and the RSPB and all this stuff. So yes, he has an interest in conservation. He has an interest in nature. But I think, it's time, Michael, given the wildfires that we're seeing at the moment, it's probably time we had a more informed conversation than Boris Johnson's dad. Right now we're seeing we're seeing the worst fires in Greece, Italy, Turkey in decades. Yesterday in Algeria, 65 people died. We're seeing the biggest wildfire in the history of California. All of that combined is still smaller than the amount of wildfire, the amount of surface area covered by wildfires right now in Siberia. We're seeing something truly extraordinary. And the BBC, the public service broadcaster of one of the world's most powerful, wealthy countries, is getting the Prime Minister's sort of bumbling dad on, which is terrifying, frankly. And the thing he said, by the way, what he said was completely nonsensical about, we'll have a carbon tax and that'll help the white van man. The one argument against the carbon tax, I would favour a carbon tax, but I would actually have it as my number 2 below creation of a carbon coin or quantitative easing to pay for decarbonisation. You have to have that first. Because the worry with a carbon tax is the primary way of addressing this, Michael, is of course it's a regressive tax. And like with a tax on smoking or alcohol, it can be very effective, of course, at changing behaviour, but it's not equitable. And the worry is, you might think, well, so what? Sorry, this is a bigger problem than that. The worry is, if you look at the Gilets jaunes, you could see mass movements against the kinds of change we now need to deliver to tackle climate change in the face of this stuff because of these unfair taxes. So carbon taxation, really important, obviously part of the mix, but I think fundamentally he's wrong there too. The BBC is meant to be better than this, Michael. I mean, Christ, you're about to show us why, but I thought it was a spoof at first. There's been a few of those this week.
It's especially the environmentalist tag that gives it that spoof quality. I want to bring up a tweet from Neon. Neon are the New Economy Organisers network. They're a sort of network of people who pitch academics and activists to TV shows. We often use them on this show. And they tweeted with this screenshot of Stanley Johnson labelled as an environmentalist. Dear BBC Newsnight, over the last 4 days, we have been pitching 8 different diverse climate scientists, policy experts, academics and activists with many decades of climate experience between them to discuss the IPCC report. There was no need for this to happen. I think that's a good reminder. Stanley Johnson was there. Someone else could have been in that place who was far better qualified to have the discussion he was having, but who didn't happen to be the father of the Prime Minister. It's really odd style of democracy whereby being related to an elected politician, you get to have such a loud voice. We shouldn't pretend there weren't experts on that show, though, and that's what made this particularly surreal, because Stanley Johnson was on the sofa with 2 people with really significant expertise. One was the economist Vicky Price. We've had her on the show before. The other was Kate Raworth, who is the author of a book, Donut Economics. Raworth made an interesting argument about growth and climate and the relation between one and the other. Let's take a look.
I think it's time to deeply think again about the essentials of our economies. Nothing on planet Earth thrives by trying to grow forever. And we've inherited a 20th century framework that believes that endless economic growth is the sign of success. And yet nothing on Earth does that. It's time to get beyond this deep dependence on endless growth and reach an economy that can thrive. And this is, in fact, the existential economic question of our times. And I think what's stopping a lot of the action that we already know we need on climate change is government's endless addiction and dependency on creating growth. So we need to put this question at the center of reframing our economies now.
And you, of course, have been very influential on Extinction Rebellion, but just explain, what does a post-growth economy actually look like? What's the difference? Tell me how it would operate.
Oh, it's an economy that no longer assumes the absurdity that it must get 3.5% bigger every year, year on year on year on year. I mean, the absurdity is the idea of an economy that grows forever. That's the one that needs to be explained. We live in one of the richest economies in the world, at the richest point of humanity. This country is richer than almost any country has ever been in the history of humankind. How is it that our politicians and our economists think that success depends upon yet more growth forever? That is what needs to be explained. Everything in nature grows and grows up, and that is how we come to thrive. From our own bodies, and inside our own bodies, if we try to grow endlessly, we call it cancer, and we know it is death to our body. We need to take what we know in the human body and take it now to the planetary body.
It's pretty surreal seeing those 2 incredibly distinguished experts up on the screen, and then it pans to Stanley Johnson sort of guffawing as he leans back on the couch in that way that especially posh people do. Aaron, I don't show that clip, though, just to see the pan to Stanley Johnson. I showed that clip because I was actually particularly interested in what your take was on it. Fully automated luxury communism, what's its take on growth, degrowth, and the climate? What's the line?
What's the line? Good question. That's the question, Michael. I'm glad you asked. Also, I just want to, before I answer that question, Michael, it's important to say what Kate Raworth is saying there about growth. What does a post-growth world look like? Hey, Kirsty Walk, we've only really talked about macroeconomic growth as a priority since the 1940s. The concept of GDP was created in the 1930s. The idea that it's been around there. We had capitalism a long time before we had this obsession with GDP growth. Actually, capitalists are more interested in profit than growth, right? As we've seen, by the way, in the last 10 years, there are many more billionaires, despite the fact that, many economies, including Britain, on a per head basis, stayed broadly stagnant. But we've produced lots more billionaires. So the idea that, what does a post-growth world look like? Well, we know because that's what we lived in until this became the sort of prevailing orthodoxy about 80 years ago. It's not, it wasn't 10,000 years ago. They weren't making stone tools in Mesopotamia saying, we need to increase, production this year by 5% and we'll compound that over 10 years and we'll get, it's very new. In terms of where fully automated luxury communism is on this, Michael, yeah, we obviously need to move beyond GDP. GDP is a very, very, very poor. This is so hackneyed. You say it so many times, you think everybody knows this. And of course, our viewers know this. And I think instinctively, most people know this. But I'll give you a classic example of GDP growth. Great quote, by the way, from Robert Kennedy on this. No radical, really. He was trying to get the Democratic nomination for US president, the brother of John F. Kennedy. He talks about how GDP measures everything but that which makes life worth living. And I'll give you an example. If you have 10 houses all next to one another on a street, and each of those houses has a kid, right? There's 2 parents and 1 child, right? Very sorry. Hate to be so stereotypical. 2 parents and 1 child. And they all look after their own children. And of course, these are good left-wing families. So the father and the mother, or the mother and the mother, both parents raise the child equally. Okay? Good communist parents. Don't need to be communist to do it. Just good 21st century parenting. There's no cash transactions going on there, right, Michael? There's no money changing hands. There's no growth. Now, if each house knocks on the door next door and says, I want you to look after my child and I'll pay you £10 an hour to do it, and they all do that, we're in the exact same situation where each house is looking after a child. It's just not their own one, and they're being paid to do so. Now, in the world of GDP, that is fantastic for the economy because you've just added a huge amount of demand into the economy. And you've just expanded all the economic transactions in existence. Because what is GDP? GDP measures all the economic transactions in a particular territory, in a particular year, in a given year. That tends to be what it means. So the GDP of Britain for 2021 is around, I don't know, $2 trillion US, something like that. And that's comprised of all these transactions between individuals, between firms, etc. So that should make it quite clear that actually, in and of itself, this isn't a good thing. For instance, we could legalize drugs. You might not think, I don't think drugs are a problem, but you might not like drugs. We could legalize drugs and they would be part of GDP. And overnight, which is what would happen, you'd have probably quite a big increase in GDP stats because all this stuff previously in the black market, heroin, cocaine, cannabis, is legalized. And now these are regular economic transactions. GDP would go up. It's questionable if that would actually be good for society. So GDP is not a measure of how successful or prosperous a society is. Clearly, it needs to be part of some broader indicator, which has multiple aspects: literacy, life expectancy, I think self-reported happiness, I think carbon emissions, time off, leisure time. So you want some sort of aggregated metric by which to judge society. I think clearly we want to judge success, right? As Peter Drucker said, you can't manage what you don't measure. I think clearly, as a socialist, you want to measure things, but I don't think GDP is a particularly good measure. And that's not just me saying it, by the way. Simon Kuznets, the person who invented the measure in the 1930s, never intended GDP to be treated like it is. Never, ever, ever. He said, this is completely at odds with what I've done. Not his own words, but he effectively had created, he was Dr. Frankenstein, he'd created a monster. So yeah, there's a place for measuring economic transactions, but if it's just GDP and not happiness, not CO2 emissions, you have big problems, and that's where we are. We've got big problems. We're not even measuring the things we should be measuring, which is why, Michael, right now we've got Sicily, 49 degrees C. We've got a place in Syria, 49 degrees C, because we don't have an economic system which says, well, what are we prioritizing here? Right now, it's just economic value, expanding, expanding, expanding. And we're destroying the planet in the meantime, and ourselves, it should be said.
We have got one more story to get through, so we will keep this quick. But I do just want to ask, Aaron, it seems to me there are two issues here, right? So one is GDP a good accounting mechanism for whether or not we're moving in the right direction? The other is, do we want consumption to keep increasing? And I suppose why I'm agnostic about the degrowth question is that I do want consumption on a global level to keep increasing. And I feel like that's kind of the fully automated luxury communism argument, is that, yes, let's have consumption keep increasing. So that's, I mean, my consumption probably doesn't need to increase very much at all. But on a global level, I think there are lots of people whose consumptions could do with, getting to the level that mine is as a happy middle class guy living in the West, right? So I don't think I am for degrowth. Is that, am I misunderstanding something here?
I get the point, Michael. I think going back to GDP, if you look at, for instance, healthcare in the UK, I think we have indisputably a better healthcare system than the US. We spend, I mean, it used to be 8% of GDP, now it's about 10%. In the US, they spend twice as much. They spend about 20% on as a percentage of health, as a percentage of GDP goes on healthcare. Yet millions of people aren't covered. They have far more women die in childbirth. They have a lower life expectancy. On most important measures, the United States is not as good as the UK on healthcare. By the way, Cuba has a longer life expectancy. So if you were to say to a developing country, oh, well, more consumption, higher GDP means you can have a healthcare system like the US rather than the UK, it's not a great measure. Do we need, and this is where Marxism is very useful, sorry to bore our viewers, this is where you need to make a big distinction between use values and exchange values. An exchange value is something produced for profit. A use value is produced because somebody needs it. Yeah, of course, in the global south and actually in the global north, we need more housing, we need more schools, we need more medical care, we need more elderly care, we need all that infrastructure. But the idea that that's going to be measured through GDP, I think, is incorrect, Michael. And so in terms of GDP, I think the framing fundamentally of growth versus degrowth, I don't think is very helpful. If we decarbonize the planet's energy systems in the next 20 years, you would see an immense amount of economic growth, huge. All these contractors, all these, resources being used, all the labor being employed. Of course, you wouldn't do it because of that, but it would happen. It would definitely be an externality of it, because you'd basically see something like the New Deal done on a planetary level times 10. So I think that kind of binary, growth versus degrowth, doesn't really work. I think we need to focus on our carbon emissions. I think we need to focus on leisure time, and I think we need to work on self-reported happiness. I think that's probably a better way of looking at it, Michael. We certainly need something other than GDP in terms of analyzing our success as societies. Any good little neoliberal goes to the Economist magazine every week. They look at the back, they look at their GDP stats, and the country with the highest GDP stats, they go, that country is doing well. They've got 5% this quarter. That country's only got Turkmenistan with 5% this quarter's doing better than this country with only 1%. By that measure, Italy over the last 20 years is the worst country to live in on earth. Clearly it isn't. Has one of the longest life expectancies in the world, has very high reported happiness, low rates of suicide, low rates of insomnia, I think. So these are pretty good indicators of mental health. So I think growth versus degrowth not quite accurate, really. But I sympathise. I'm more with Kate Rayworth and somebody who says, "Oh, we need more growth," because I think if you have a global Green New Deal, you're clearly going to have growth. Of course, you are. That shouldn't be the goal, though, Michael.
We should say with Italy, I don't think they'd say they were the most, because they would have said that their happiness has increased the least over the past 20 years, because Italy hasn't had much growth for 20 years, but they still do have a much higher GDP per capita than most people in the world. I'm not sure how it compares to the UK. Anyway, we should move on to our next story. Before we do that, let's go to a comment. Zay Toik I beat. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that's a reference to. But anyway, you've given us a huge donation. Thank you very much for that. $89.99. This is for Ash saying on Channel 5, have you read the book? Just watched the clip a minute ago. Legend. That was a clip from Ash on the Jeremy Vine show on Monday. We've just put out a clip of that today. You can check that out on our YouTube channel. And thank you again for that very generous super chat. Final story. I think we can get an image up for this one. You've seen it already. It's now the time for that image. Britain's most disgraced citizen may now finally face justice as he's sued in the United States for alleged sexual abuse. Virginia Giuffre has filed a lawsuit against Prince Andrew, who she accuses of sexually abusing her at the mansion of Jeffrey Epstein, as well as other locations when she was under 18. The lawsuit seeks unspecified compensatory and punitive damages. The lawsuit claims, this is a quote from the lawsuit as it has been filed, Giuffre was compelled by express or implied threats by Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and or Prince Andrew to engage in sexual acts with Prince Andrew and feared death or physical injury to herself or another and other repercussions for disobeying Epstein, Maxwell, and Prince Andrew due to their powerful connections, wealth, and authority. It also alleges that Prince Andrew knew that Giuffre was a sex trafficking victim and that she had suffered and continues to suffer significant emotional and psychological distress and harm. 20 years ago, Prince Andrew's wealth, power, position, and connections enabled him to abuse a frightened, vulnerable child with no one there to protect her. It is long past the time for him to be held to account. So you probably will know a lot of the background to this story. In case you don't, there was a great update, an ABC report. So this is the context, the background to the case. Giuffre, now a 38-year-old mother living in Australia, first accused the prince of sexual abuse in public court filings in December 2014 in a case brought by alleged Epstein victims against the US Department of Justice. That lawsuit challenged Epstein's lenient deal with federal prosecutors in Florida in 2008. Giuffre alleged in those court submissions that she was directed by Epstein and his longtime associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, to have sex with Andrew on 3 occasions in 2001 in London, New York, and the US Virgin Islands. Her claims were met then with vehement denials from Maxwell and from Buckingham Palace on behalf of the prince, the second son of Britain's Queen Elizabeth II. Giuffre's attorney, David Boris, has been speaking about the case. He stated that Prince Andrew has been consistently uncooperative, and basically that's what's pushed them to file this lawsuit. So he said, since 2015, we've been trying to have a dialogue with Prince Andrew or his lawyers. We have given him every opportunity to provide any explanation or context that he might have. We've tried to reach a resolution without the necessary necessity of litigation. Prince Andrew and his lawyers have been totally non-responsive. We've discussed a lot how Prince Andrew, it seems, has been incredibly uncooperative in this case, either about allegations that relate directly to him or about allegations that relate to Jeffrey Epstein. We know that the American authorities were seeking an interview with Prince Andrew because of their investigation into Epstein and Maxwell. Prince Andrew was unwilling to go. It seems this uncooperative attitude has spanned every aspect of the case. This week, Boys has spoken, so that's Giuffre's attorney, spoken to the BBC about his client's motivation for bringing the case.
I think what she wants, first and foremost, is vindication. I think first and foremost, she wants to call Prince Andrew to account in court and to allow a jury and a judge to determine the truth of her accusations. I think that she's tried every way she can to resolve this short of litigation. But at this point, litigation is the only way to establish once and for all what the truth is. And litigation is the only way to establish once and for all what Prince Andrew's evidence actually is. Thus far, he's not been required to come forward and state his defense subject to cross-examination. Litigation will require him to do that. I think secondarily, she's looking to be compensated for the damage that she's done, that has been done to her. As you know, she has donated a significant amount of money from the recoveries that she has previously received from Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell to her charitable foundation that is dedicated to trying to help victims of sex trafficking. And I think that she wants to further those goals as well. And finally, I think she wants to send a message to every rich and powerful person who engages in sex trafficking and abuses young girls, that this is not acceptable, and that you cannot hide behind wealth and power and palace walls. You will be held to account for your actions in a court of law, and it will be up to a jury to decide your fate.
That was Virginia Giuffre's attorney talking about her motivations for filing this lawsuit against Prince Andrew. Some more context to the case. You might be wondering, why is this case being brought now, 20 years after the abuse was alleged to have happened? And also, it's been 5 years since Giuffre has gone public with this. It was in that deposition when she was filing a lawsuit against Ghislaine Maxwell. The answer is quite interesting. It's happening now because New York, where this case is filed, introduced a Child Victims Act in 2019, which allowed alleged survivors of under 18 sexual abuse to bring forward cases which were previously time barred. So if there was a case for an alleged abuse which previously had a statute of limitation, so you had to take a person to court within 5, 10 years, however long the statute of limitation was, for this year only, you can take people to court even if the alleged abuse happened in the past. Now, the window, so there was a set time period where people would be allowed to take advantage of this act, and that ends this week. So this was actually the last chance, really, for Giuffre to take Prince Andrew to court. So she's taken it now, because if she'd waited another week even, it could have been impossible. In terms of what could happen next, now the American legal system can seem quite complicated to an outsider. The Telegraph had quite a good rundown, actually, of the options now facing Prince Andrew on whether the Duke will take the stand, so whether he will have to give evidence in court. They say it is unlikely. That's not an attractive proposition, since a cross-examination of Prince Andrew is unlikely to go well. His performance on Newsnight was one of the great car crash interviews, and a grilling by a skilled New York attorney risks a terrifying humiliation. A trip to the US also raises the possibility of the FBI bringing him in for questioning as part of its ongoing investigation into Epstein's crimes. Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's former girlfriend and close friend of Prince Andrew, goes on trial on child sex trafficking charges in autumn. So they're saying, he will probably be asked to give evidence in court. He's going to be very unlikely to do that because he would be cross-examined by an attorney. It would be like that Newsnight interview all over again, potentially even tougher this time, because while Emily Maitlis did very well in that interview, she's not an attorney. On whether Prince Andrew could just ignore the claim, so could he just say, oh, this is going on in America, I'm not going to have anything to do with this at all? Of that, the Telegraph write, one possible course of action is to do nothing and ignore any attempts by Ms. Giuffre's legal team to serve him with legal papers. However, such a strategy risks a civil trial going ahead in his absence and would hugely increase the chances of a judge finding in the claimant's favour. Such a ruling would be catastrophic for the prince, because then a court would be officially labelling him as child sex abuser. So they're saying, it is possible for him just to completely ignore this case. They can't extradite him for this because it's civil litigation. It's not criminal litigation. It's not something you can be sent to prison for. It would be suing for damages. He could ignore it, but if he ignores it, that means he's likely to lose it. And then that would mean that an American court has found that he was guilty of sexually abusing a minor. So that's not an outcome that he wants either. Finally, they suggest, and this is a bit of a curveball, they say it could be the case that they could try and switch the trial to the UK. So lawyers with good knowledge of the case suggest that the prince could try to force the case to be switched to the High Court in London, where they could try to have it struck out on grounds of lack of evidence. If that is unsuccessful, the prince might also argue that he has some form of sovereign or crown immunity because he was a working member of the royal family and a part of the British state apparatus at the time of the alleged incidents. That latter option of bringing this to the UK Crown Courts or the UK High Court, I'm not in a position to tell you how plausible or not that is. What I find particularly shocking about this case, and we've talked about this before actually, is how little pressure has been put on Prince Andrew to cooperate with all of these cases, whether it's pertaining to allegations which are directly against him or pertaining to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and he might have useful information about it. There has been no moral pressure whatsoever, it seems, from this country's establishment to say, look, if you got involved in these things, we know that your close friend was, a convicted child abuser. You've got these allegations against you. What you have to do is you have to face these charges. You have to have your day in court, and you at the very least have to give an interview to the FBI about Ghislaine Maxwell, about Jeffrey Epstein. He's basically used every legal avenue possible to avoid any of this scrutiny, and everyone's just let him get away with it. I really do feel like if you had Boris Johnson saying this guy was working at the time for the British monarchy, essentially for the British state, we cannot accept that someone who is working for the British state is shirking their responsibility when it comes to something as serious as child sexual abuse. Instead, they all just say, oh, nothing to do with us. Oh, what an embarrassment. Prince Andrew, what an embarrassing guy. Hopefully he won't be on the front line of royal politics again. Why aren't we seeing this outcry of people saying, look, whether or not you think Prince Andrew has sexually abused a child, the least he should do is have his day in court? How is he able to avoid that?
Well, there's two reasons, Michael. Firstly, a lot of people are potentially implicated, aren't they? It's important to say that Jeffrey Epstein knew Bill Gates. He knew, Andrew Neil, Peter Mandelson, Alistair Campbell was in his little black book. And so I think it'd be very difficult for many of these people, many people at the top of British media and politics, to go all guns blazing because they're implicated. Not to the fact that they knew this was happening necessarily, or that they were past it. Of course, I'm not saying that, but they were acquaintances or friends with Jeffrey Epstein. So there's that dynamic at work, which I think is probably a big one. It can't be understated. Then secondly, and of course this is the bigger one, is the fact was because Prince Andrew's, he's the son of the monarch. He's the son of the Queen of England. Well, I should say that, sorry. He's the son of the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and its Crown Territories, because the Isle of Man has nothing to do with Britain. It actually belongs to the Queen, like Jersey, etc. And there are two areas, Michael, in this country's sort of political discourse in terms of media and journalism. There are two areas which I don't think in any way are dealt with in a remotely sort of democratic, popular, professional way. When I say popular, as in they're sort of scrutable to ordinary people. The first is foreign policy and defense. We made this huge screw up in Afghanistan 20 years ago. You can't get Tony Blair off the television normally. You won't see him talking about this. And nobody will be doorstepping Tony Blair in Afghanistan like they were with Jeremy Corbyn if he, made a cup of tea the wrong way. They were outside his front door every day of the week for literally years. We're not seeing any scrutiny of the same politicians who were responsible for this calamity in Afghanistan. The reason being, foreign defense policy isn't really subject to the kind of media scrutiny you'd expect in democracy. Alongside that is the royal family, the monarchy. It just doesn't happen. And we saw that with the Princess Di interview. Martin Bashir, he acted improperly, but the sort of media fallout to that being admitted by the BBC lasted for weeks. The BBC reported on the BBC for weeks because it basically had to self-flagellate very publicly to atone for its sins, which is even daring to hold the monarchy accountable, or people inside the monarchy accountable. So the royal family and foreign policy and defense policy, on these two things, we don't have a media which asks the right questions. Not because they can't, not even because they don't want to. It's just not the done thing. You're not going to get very far in Britain's media and its sort of politics if you ask difficult questions of the Queen. My goodness. So that's why. But I think that's doubly the case because, like I say, so many people, Michael, so many people are implicated. Jeffrey Epstein knew so many powerful people, and they just want this whole episode over.
It's difficult to argue with that analysis. We have done a fair amount of coverage of this case. If you do want to know more, I would recommend going to look back at the episode we did with the True and Non podcast, who are really the go-to people when it comes to some of the more unsaid dark elements to this particular story. We are going to wrap up there. Aaron Bastani, it's been a pleasure as always.
It's been my pleasure, Michael. You've been the Novara Media MVP through August, same as every month. Thank you. All your viewers know that. I just thought I had to say it.
Thank you. I do appreciate that. Maybe summer is going to begin again. Who knows? Thank you for watching tonight. We'll be back on Friday, I presume. I lose track of the days sometimes. And we'll be back on Friday at 7 p.m. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.